Hey everyone, welcome to Dark Dossier. Before we dive into the video, comment your city down below. I wanna see where you're all tuning in from. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss out. Let's get started. Story 1. The Midnight Vanishing at Wagga Wagga. Wagga Wagga, New South Wales, 1876. A town wrapped in riverbanks and routine, where the daily rhythm of life was punctuated by railway whistles and the creak of wagons hauling promise across dusty outposts. On the night of August 4th, a small, unmarked crate bound for Sydney left the Wagga Rail Yard aboard a mixed freight and passenger train. Its contents, officially noted only as ore samples, were far more valuable than anyone outside a small circle realized. Packed within layers of sawdust, wrapped in stitched canvas, and nailed shut by trusted hands, the crate held 8.2 kilograms of raw alluvial gold dust, the result of months of small-scale mining up the Murrumbidgee River. A quiet transaction, no guards, no fanfare. The shipment was organized by Albert Fenwick, a mild-mannered mining agent with a ledger obsession and a reputation for doing things by the book. He had insisted on this route Wagga to Junee, then down the main south line precisely because of its predictability. But predictability, it seemed, would be its undoing. When the train arrived in Junee, the crate was gone. The chain of custody. It began with confusion. The station foreman, Walter Cribb, checked the manifest 3 times. Fenwick's crate was listed between sacks of wool and a consignment of telegraph poles. But when the guards unlocked the freight car, there was no trace, no smashed locks, no visible tampering. Could it have been misloaded? Cribb asked, though he already knew the answer. Every load had been weighed, documented, and signed off by the yardmaster, Edwin Toller, at Wagga. Toller, an ex-sailor turned railway man, had vouched for the crate personally. "We loaded it," Toller swore later. "I even marked the corner with a chalk X white chalk." But there was no chalk mark, no empty space where it had sat, and no sign of a break-in. The car had been locked, sealed in fact, with a copper wire tag still unbroken. A town that slept. Wagga wasn't a place where things went missing. Not like this. The local paper, the Murrumbidgee Gazette, buried the event in a single paragraph 2 days later, calling it a possible clerical error. But Fenwick knew it was. So did Constable James Elwood, a railway constable tasked more with chasing drunks than stolen goods. Elwood, already half retired, had a habit of walking the tracks during idle hours. He noticed something odd in the gravel embankment near the switching yard, parallel ruts where no cart should have been. The indentations suggested a hand-pushed trolley. Not uncommon, but strange at midnight. There had been no scheduled stops, no work orders. And yet someone had unloaded something heavy between the rail yard and the first bend outside Wagga. Elwood didn't mention this for days. The disappearing clerk. Attention soon turned to Harold Wicks, a junior freight clerk at Wagga. 22, pale and sharp-eyed, Wicks was known for scribbling poems on waybills and taking longer than necessary walks on his lunch break. He had clocked in the night of the shipment but hadn't stayed on his shift. His reason, stomach upset, he claimed. He left the depot just 15 minutes before the train departed. When questioned later, he said he didn't recall seeing the gold crate but had heard Toller shouting about chalk marks. Toller denied shouting. He hadn't spoken to Wicks at all that night. 2 days later, Wicks was gone. His room at the boarding house was cleared, rent unpaid. The landlady remembered only that he had mentioned heading south. The missing trolley. Elwood, now convinced something had happened between 11:30 p.m. and 12:15 a.m., the window between loading and departure, began his own quiet investigation. He discovered that the track workers' tool shed, located behind the old mill, had been left unlocked that night. A flatbed trolley, usually chained to the wall, was missing. It was returned the next morning. Cleaned. Too clean. The muddy canvas. 10 days into the silent mystery, A farmer named Caleb Morton reported something odd near his property, 5 kilometers down the line. Cattle refused to graze near a particular stretch of brush. Investigating, Morton found canvas fabric embedded in the mud, torn and stained with what he described as metallic earth. Fenwick identified the fabric as identical to what he'd used to wrap the gold dust bags. No crates, no gold, just canvas. A crime without witnesses. There were no screams, no alarms, no guards caught unaware. Whoever removed the crate had known the route, the timing, the manifest, and the sealing procedures. They had access to a tool shed. They had the strength to lift a 30 kg box, and they had the discipline to vanish without even triggering a broken wire seal. Was it Wicks, the poetic clerk, or Toller, the old yardmaster who swore he'd seen the chalk mark? Or was it something broader, a ring of railway insiders running a quiet pipeline for vanishing gold? And why had Fenwick insisted on an escort? That question, perhaps, lingered the most in Elwood's mind. Why did a man so careful take such a dangerous risk? When something disappears without noise, without trace, and without the weight of outrage, you begin to understand how many crimes in history weren't solved, because no one really wanted them to be. Constable James Elwood knew this. He'd watched far louder cases die quietly, wives gone missing without men facing consequence, livestock poisoned without charges laid, station fires blamed on faulty lanterns when matches were found in the cinders. But gold, that was supposed to mean pressure, panic, retribution. Instead, silence. The discreet network. The moment Harold Wicks disappeared, Elwood had made a list. Wicks, the freight clerk with odd hours. Yardmaster Edwin Toller, who claimed to mark the crate. Fenwick, the mining agent who pushed for this unguarded route. A local blacksmith, seldom employed but known to accept sudden payments in silver. A telegraph assistant at Uranquinty, who was seen talking to Wicks days earlier. None of these names were formally accused. There was no official case. But Elwood began writing the line, writing it alone. Borrowing the maintenance pump cart, he visited sidings, sheds, tool stations, asking quiet questions with less than official authority. What he found was not a trail of evidence but an atmosphere, a feeling that something coordinated had happened and that it wasn't the first time. The letters. 2 weeks after the crate's disappearance, Wicks was spotted in Adelong, a gold mining town farther south. A storekeeper recognized him from a drawing Elwood had distributed, said the young man had bought a notebook, sealing wax, and a small parcel of expensive tobacco. But what caught Elwood's attention was this. Wicks had asked if the storekeeper handled mail drops. It was common enough in remote areas. People would leave or collect mail at general stores. Elwood returned days later, and the shopkeeper handed him a letter addressed to a C. Dunn undelivered, since no one by that name ever showed. Elwood opened it. It read, "The crate made it to the switch. 3 men, 1 cart, no one questioned. Your trust was not misplaced. Will stage again after full melt. T's yard safe. H." It was unsigned but unmistakable. H was Harold. T's yard likely meant Toller. Melted. Furnace in the orchard. Gold dust isn't spent like coins, it must be processed. Smelted into bars or mixed into new forms before it can be sold without suspicion. A shipment of raw dust is traceable, but bars, especially if the origin can be denied or blurred, they move more easily. Elwood returned to Wagga and did something unorthodox. He spoke to the widow of a former smelter, a woman named Mrs. Martha Dyer, who had once worked at a private furnace outside the rail yards. Her late husband had run a forge for the railway company, metal repairs, axle molds, the like, but he died years ago. Martha had recently sold the forge's land to a syndicate that never really moved in. Elwood rode out to the lot and found an orchard covering what used to be the forge foundation. Beneath the fruit trees, scorched earth remained. Elwood dug with his walking stick and uncovered slag waste material from recent smelting. Someone had used the old forge again. Recently, a shadow from Sydney. Just as Elwood was preparing a report, though to whom, he wasn't sure, a man arrived in Wagga by way of Sydney. He didn't identify himself as police. Said his name was Mr. Delancey, that he was from the board. Which board he wouldn't say. Well dressed, no dust on his shoes. Delancey made rounds quietly, speaking with Fenwick and Toller. He didn't visit the constabulary. He stayed at the Riverina Hotel, drank only tea, and left after 2 days. But after his departure, something changed. Fenwick, who had been agitated and desperate, now seemed calm. He stopped asking the rail office for updates. Toller, who had refused interviews, began sleeping at the station. Elwood noticed he carried a revolver now, holstered under his coat. No charges, no inquiry. Just changes. The second shipment. A month passed. Then a new shipment arrived in Wagga, 12 kilograms, this time split across 3 smaller crates, all packed under flour sacks loaded during the day. No secrecy, no rush. Again, Fenwick arranged it. Again, no guard. Elwood watched as the crates were moved into the same freight car. This time, he stayed aboard. At the first siding outside Wagga, the train slowed, not unusual. What was unusual was the trolley waiting behind a copse of trees. Elwood saw 2 figures in the dusk, one tall, one limping, and a faint flash of white chalk on the side of one of the new crates. He shouted before thinking. The figures fled, the trolley tipped. The train continued. When they arrived in Juni, the crates were intact. Fenwick never acknowledged the incident. Whispers in iron. 2 days later, Elwood received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a small square of canvas, identical to the one found in the mud earlier. Sewn into the fold was a scrap of paper. You're not wrong, but not everything is theft. Some things are trade, and some debts are owed far higher up than you can reach. Stop asking. He never shared the letter. But he began locking his door at night. The Vanishing Network. By the start of 1877, the entire cast of the event had shifted. Wicks was never found again. Toller resigned due to health, then moved to Queensland. Fenwick dissolved his agency and left for Tasmania. The orchard land was sold again, this time to a school committee, who never built a school. Mr. Delancey never recorded at the Riverina Hotel ledger. Only Elwood remained. He had written hundreds of pages in his notebook by then. Diagrams, maps, names, sketches, but none of it had been published. He sent copies to Sydney, one to the Railway Commission, another to the Sydney Morning Herald. Neither responded. The theft of 8.2 kilograms of gold dust from Wagga Wagga was never prosecuted. Officially, it never happened. But what had Elwood stumbled into? Was this theft part of a single crime or one glimpse of a systemic operation, hidden beneath legitimate mining exports and routine freight schedules? And who was Mr. Delancey, enforcer, protector, or something else entirely? Most of all, what did they mean by after full melt? By the spring of 1877, Constable James Elwood was tired. He still walked the Wagga rail yards most mornings, still watched the freight manifests for signs of patterns, and still recorded his thoughts in his thick, weather-cracked notebook. But something in him had changed. He'd spent months circling a theft no one officially acknowledged, surrounded by names that had evaporated like steam off iron rails. He believed he was chasing a network, something quiet, entrenched, and old. Not a gang, something sanctioned. And so, in his own slow way, he began trying to understand not just how the gold had vanished, but why the people involved had gotten away so cleanly. The truth, as it turned out, wasn't buried in the dirt. It was hidden in paperwork. The waybill loophole. A fellow constable in Albury, Ralph Clancy, had once mentioned something in passing, a discrepancy in weight records, a shipment of seed grain that, on closer inspection, had weighed nearly 3 times what such a load should have. No investigation followed. The crate arrived in Melbourne, signed and offloaded without issue, but Clancy kept a copy of the waybill and years later sent it to Elwood. The shipping origin: Wagga Wagga. The sender: C. Dunn. That same false name from the intercepted letter. Elwood dug further and found 6 more waybills, each using different commodity descriptions: agricultural tools, wool fleeces, potash, and in one case, mining tailings. The shipping weight always exceeded the likely cargo. But what made it real was this: none of the crates were ever inspected at destination. They had traveled under a low-risk manifest profile, bundled with larger, legitimate shipments, and protected by trusted clerks' signatures, including Harold Wick's. Elwood now saw the mechanism. Gold dust was being extracted, packed, shipped as ordinary freight, then swapped en route or melted later. Not a single grand heist, a system. The man who talked. In May 1878, a man named Terence Vaux was arrested in Dubbo on unrelated charges: minor fraud, impersonation of a constable. When questioned, he claimed knowledge of an operation involving the trains. Elwood traveled to Dubbo. Vaux was frail, likely addicted to laudanum and deeply paranoid, but he repeated the same name: Delancey. He came through Sydney twice, Vaux said. Wore clean gloves, always had a coat that didn't match the dust. He didn't threaten, he just asked, and you said yes. Vaux claimed the gold was never meant to go to Sydney banks. Instead, it was diverted by quiet agreement with certain agents and melted in private foundries, either in Goulburn or further afield. The profits were reinvested in land, not gold bars, not cash. Think of it as nationalization, Vaux said with a crooked grin, but done by men in waistcoats instead of Parliament. The trial that never was. By 1879, Elwood had assembled a detailed dossier. He submitted it to the New South Wales Railway Commissioners. 3 months later, he received a reply. It read, "Constable Elwood, your findings have been reviewed. While interesting in historical context, there is insufficient evidence to warrant further investigation. The alleged theft described is not actionable under current law. We thank you for your diligence. Office of Internal Review, NSW Commission." Elwood was stunned. He realized that without an official record of a crime, no complaint from Fenwick, no missing property declared, there was no case, and perhaps, more disturbingly, no desire to have one. He wasn't dealing with a rogue set of criminals. He was dealing with a quietly tolerated economic adjustment. The quiet exit. In 1880, Elwood retired. His pension was modest. He declined an offer to transfer to Sydney. Before leaving, he donated his notebooks to the Wagga Historical Society, though no one there read them at the time. One dusty volume, misfiled under miscellaneous rail notes, would remain unopened until 1921, when a young curator rediscovered the strange entry marked simply, "Crate the Vanishing." By then, the orchard over the old forge had been cut down, and under the tree roots, workers found slag, canvas, and the charred remnants of a shipping crate. No gold. No names. Just dust. A story retold. The theft at Wagga Wagga was never officially solved. There were no arrests. No articles in the Sydney Morning Herald. No court transcripts. No police bulletins. Not even a whisper in the parliamentary records. But certain patterns followed the event. Over the next 2 decades, unusual real estate transactions cropped up near railway towns across New South Wales. Small parcels of land bought for cash, often by intermediaries. occasionally by names connected to former railway workers. Some historians now suggest these were investment laundering fronts for the gold thefts, quiet ways of converting melted gold into generational assets. As for James Elwood, he died in 1902. No obituary, no mention of the work he had tried to pursue. His grave reads simply, "He watched the tracks." And so the question remains, how many crimes are forgotten not because they were solved, but because someone in power decided they should disappear? If 8.2 kilograms of gold dust can vanish without consequence, what else has passed silently through the carriages of history, chalk-marked and unseen? Story 2, Coal Dust and Gold Lies, the Galburn Station Diversion. Galburn, New South Wales. In the latter part of 1883, this town straddled two identities: a burgeoning urban hub fueled by the Southern Main Railway line, and a working-class outpost reliant on coal and cattle, with its heartbeat in the rail yards and supply depots. The Galburn Station was a hub of movement: outbound livestock, inbound coal, and, twice weekly, quiet shipments of mineral wealth, primarily quartz and gold dust from regional diggings in Crookwell and Bungonia. These shipments didn't come in guarded coaches or armored wagons. They came as parcels registered but discreet, sometimes hidden among engine parts or wool bales. That's what made the September 3rd shipment stand out, not for what it contained, but for the fact that, on paper, it never existed. The invisible crate. It began as a routine dispatch. The station ledger noted a sealed crate addressed to M.J. Liddell, Circular Quay, Sydney, registered by a mining contractor named Thomas Barrage, who had delivered parcels before. Barrage was a known quantity, former prospector, now a liaison for small claims holders looking to convert dust into Sydney banknotes. The crate was described simply as mineral samples, weighing 38 kilograms. But Barrage quietly told station master Hale it was the real thing: unrefined dust and small nugget clusters collected over 12 weeks, packed in sawdust and sealed in tin-lined canvas sacks. Estimated value: upwards of £2,800. The crate was recorded at 5:18 p.m. At 5:40, it was loaded onto freight car 218B, alongside 3 crates of mining tools and a shipment of Newcastle coal. The manifest noted the destination, the sender, and the total weight. At 6:05 p.m., the train departed for Sydney. By 6:20 p.m., a second version of the manifest was filed, one that excluded the crate entirely. The clerk who didn't blink. When the train reached Sydney's Redfern yard, the crates were offloaded and sorted. But there was no crate addressed to Liddell. The Sydney station manifest, carbon-copied from Galburn's own, as per procedure, showed no sign of it ever being aboard. At first, Barrage was calm. Mistakes happen. Documents get lost. But when the original hand-signed dispatch record vanished from the Galburn ledger room, he grew suspicious. He approached railway clerk Benjamin Croft, a soft-spoken man in his 30s known for his neat handwriting and habit of recopying daily manifests for clarity. Croft's response was curiously flat. "If it wasn't on the train, sir, I can't very well help you recover it." Croft was the last person to retranscribe the day's manifest, and in his version, crate L14M, they did not appear. What the station master saw. Station Master Elias Hale, a stoic man with an impeccable uniform and a love for order, swore he'd seen the crate loaded. He had even noted the weight manually before the porter sealed the freight door. The porter, Alan Doyle, recalled helping push the heavy crate into place. He described the stenciling white letters, MJL, and the shape of the tin rim around the box's edge. But once the Sydney team denied the item ever shipped, the burden of proof shifted. "You can't lose something that's not on the list," was the official response. Barrage tried filing a formal complaint. It was quietly refused. The case might have ended there, but Hale refused to let it drop. The burned pages. A week later, Hale found burnt paper scraps in the stove of the night shift breakroom, an unusual place for a fire, since the evenings were warm and dry. Piecing together the fragments, he identified part of a ledger page. The ink was smeared but not illegible. The fragment read, L14 MJ 38 kg to MJ Liddell, CQ terminal declared mineral sample, sealed. Entered by T. Barrage Hale present at Way. The handwriting matched Benjamin Croft's. And yet the official version of the manifest, the one kept in the rail office, bore no such entry. The crate had been erased. Not lost. Removed. The tunnel stop. Curious about the possible location of a mid-journey diversion, Hale began researching train logs and signal stops between Galburn and Sydney. The route passed through the Picton Tunnel, a narrow, damp stretch of track between hill ridges notorious for brief, unscheduled stops due to coal smoke backwash and elevation strain. He found a report from the firemen aboard the 3rd September train, noting that they had stopped for 3 minutes outside the tunnel to allow adjustment of the brake chain. That stop had not been logged in the journey report. No inspection was performed afterward. The coal shuffle. It was the coal that finally raised Elwood's interest. Yes, James Elwood, now long retired, living in modest solitude in Wagga, but still scribbling into notebooks and reading every mention of railway irregularity in the regional gazettes. When he read about a mislabeled coal shipment received in Sydney just after September 3rd, one that seemed unusually heavy, according to dock workers, he wrote a letter to Galburn Station. If gold were to vanish, and the manifest were to lie, I would check beneath the black that masks all sins coal. Station Master Hale had one of the 3 coal crates held back from incineration. Inside, wedged beneath shovels of raw fuel, he found torn canvas, streaked with yellow dust and tiny flecks of metal. The locked office. Before Hale could confront Clerk Croft, he found the office locked from the inside one morning. When they forced the door, Croft was gone. His desk was clear. The only thing left behind was a single envelope, addressed to no one, containing a folded note. It wasn't personal, it was procedure. So what was the procedure Croft referred to? Who authorized a crate's erasure not through theft but by deletion from documentation? And how many other shipments were vanished this way, never noticed simply because their names were never copied into the right ledger? Was this an isolated crime, or an example of how coal could cover gold in more ways than one? September 1883 faded into October with no public acknowledgement of the missing shipment. To the railway's central office, no gold was stolen because none had been listed. A vanishing without a trace is one thing, but a vanishing of the paper trail, that's something more insidious. Station Master Elias Hale, however, didn't let it rest. He had a burned scrap of the original manifest. He had a coal crate lined with gold-dusted canvas. And he had a missing clerk whose last message hinted at a procedure. He needed someone to listen, so he went south to Wagga Wagga. Return of the Watcher. Though retired, James Elwood had never truly left the tracks. Hale found him where he expected, behind the Wagga rail house, walking the rails with a cane he didn't need, still scribbling notes in that same black book. He told Elwood the story, the erased manifest, the coal crates, the 3-minute stop near Picton Tunnel. Elwood listened without interrupting, then finally nodded. Not the first, he said. And he meant it literally. Over the previous 5 years, Elwood had collected references to 9 separate shipments, all small, all originating from stations like Galburn, Queanbeyan, and Moss Vale that never reached their listed destinations. Most were described in manifests as samples, tailings, or bulk ore. None triggered investigations. Each had paperwork inconsistencies. Each train had at least one unscheduled stop. and in 4 of those cases, the freight clerk was later transferred, resigned, or disappeared. The box that wasn't there. Hale returned to Galburn with renewed focus. He reviewed station archives, hunting for other shipments logged and then erased. He found another example, this time from June 1882, registered under F. Marston and bound for Darling Harbor Freight Terminal. The box weighed 41 kg and was described as quartz concentration to be assayed. Same setup, logged at 3:10 p.m., never arrived, official copy missing. He cross-referenced the case against payroll data. The clerk who registered it, Benjamin Croft. The assistant with a map. In a stroke of luck, Hale located Richard Gow, Croft's former assistant. Gow was 19, earnest, nervous, and devoted to rules. When Hale asked about Croft, Gow hesitated, then confessed something peculiar. He kept 2 books, one for the official record, and a second one. It looked older, worn. That one he kept in a drawer beneath the floorboard, locked. Gow had once seen the second book opened. It was filled with names, weights, dates, and hand-drawn track segments. Elwood, when told of this, responded immediately. Not a clerk, a conduit. He was tracking the route, not just covering it up. The conductor's note. Hale and Elwood worked quietly, gathering testimony. A retired conductor from the 1881 freight line between Mithagen and Galburn agreed to speak only because he was terminally ill and held no affection for the system anymore. He described an event eerily similar to Hale's experience. A train stopped outside Red Bank Tunnel, a supposed wheel locking. 2 men appeared at the brake car, checked a manifest, then quietly removed a crate labeled steel ballast samples. They were not railway men. They wore no uniforms. But they had the right documents, signed by the station master himself. The conductor had asked no questions. "We were told to trust the paper," he said, "even if it smelled wrong." The switch list. Elwood finally understood what they were seeing. Not a simple theft, a paper-based rerouting system. Valuable ore was shipped without escort, registered under generic terms. A freight clerk, someone like Croft, created 2 manifests, one with the real cargo, one clean. The clean manifest was transmitted to Sydney. The original was destroyed or accidentally lost. Mid-route, an unscheduled stop occurred marked in a hidden switch list, like the one Gow described. At that stop, crates were quietly offloaded, covered, or disguised, usually via coal or wool bales. In Sydney, the train arrived as if the crate had never been there. What mattered was the cargo. What mattered was the paperwork trail and who controlled it. Return to Picton. Elwood and Hale traveled to Picton Tunnel on a foggy Thursday morning. The air was thick with moisture, and the rails glistened with residue from the night's rains. Halfway through the tunnel, they found a side track spur, barely visible and overgrown. It had once connected to an abandoned signal house, burned out, disused. Inside the ruin, they discovered what remained of an old maintenance pit, large enough to conceal a trolley or wagon. Nearby, wedged under a rock, they found tin sheeting with melted solder. Ore processing. No crate breakdown. The crate wasn't just removed here. It was dismantled, sorted, and scattered. The Galburn refusal. Armed with physical evidence, witness testimony, and 3 case comparisons, Hale submitted a report to the Rail Traffic Superintendent's office in Sydney. The response: "Thank you for your concern. The inconsistencies appear to be the result of human error. Clerk Croft's departure, while regrettable, was personal. As there is no declared loss by the railway or its clients, we do not intend to pursue further inquiry." There it was again, the institutional shrug. No loss, no crime. No victim, no case. Delancey returns. 1 week after the rejection letter, Hale received a visitor at Galburn Station. A tall, clean man with gloves and a gray hat. He said his name was Mr. Delancey, the same name Elwood had encountered years earlier in Wagga. Delancey offered no credentials. He simply asked if Hale was satisfied with the office's response. When Hale pressed, Delancey smiled. "We all benefit from a system that runs efficiently. Not all cargo needs to arrive, Mr. Hale. Some of it needs to disappear for the betterment of more important matters." And with that he left. The crime, it seemed, was never the gold dust itself. It was the existence of a parallel system, just beneath the railway's surface of diverted wealth, invisible cargo, and paperwork written to vanish. And the final question remains. What if the safest way to move gold was to hide it in the black ledger no one ever read? If you ride the rail lines between Galburn and Sydney today, the trip is scenic, quiet, nothing but rolling hills, bridgework, and long-dead tunnels echoing with soot. But in the autumn of 1883, one particular stretch of that route held a secret. A system within the system. A ghost route. And at its center, a clerk who rewrote reality. Gow's revelation. Following Mr. Delancey's cryptic visit, Station Master Hale made one final appeal, not to the authorities, but to Richard Gow, Croft's former assistant. Gow had been uneasy, but after weeks of pressure and with Elwood quietly encouraging from the sidelines, he relented. "I didn't destroy the second ledger," Gow admitted. "I was told to, but I didn't." Instead, he had wrapped it in oilcloth, placed it inside a rusted boiler behind the station coal shed, and left it to time, out of guilt, out of fear, and maybe a little out of spite. Together, Hale and Elwood retrieved the bundle. Inside, they found a battered, soot-smudged notebook. Its cover read, "Railway Supplementals Galburn Outbound 1880, 1883. It was Croft's second ledger. What the ledger contained. The book was meticulous. Each entry bore a crate reference number, a sender's pseudonym or initial, actual weight and value estimates, the listed manifest item, e.g., agricultural tools, tailings. The true contents, often dust, scrap nuggets, or composite melt. Exact coordinates for mid-route diversions. The name of the approving clerk or contact. There were 18 entries across 2 years. Most bore the same initials. BDC Benjamin D. Croft. MJD, a contact or authority figure, possibly M.J. Delancey. FME, a yet unidentified code. And at the bottom of one of the pages, scribbled in cramped handwriting, records to remain internal. No shipment declared equals no loss claim. Route integrity preserved. Gold without a trail. The entries revealed something remarkable. No shipments were reported missing. No senders filed losses. No insurance claims were made. Why? Because the gold in these crates was always privately held, pooled from small miners, undocumented diggings, and informal syndicates who relied on men like Thomas Berridge to move it for them. These weren't established companies with lobbyists or legal departments. They were prospectors, bush diggers, quiet speculators, people who would rather absorb a loss than draw scrutiny to undeclared wealth. The perfect victims for a white-collar theft committed with ink and protocol, not violence or burglary. The circular key connection. One entry referenced a shipment addressed to M.J. Liddell, CQ Terminal. Elwood cross-referenced shipping records and discovered that M.J. Liddell never appeared in circular key business listings. But there was a maritime holding agency, J. Delancey, operating for 6 months in 1883 before vanishing. It had handled logistics coordination, meaning its job was to receive goods, reship them under new documentation, and ensure no trace remained. Gold that left Galburn became ore samples from Maitland. Gold from Moss Vale became glass ballast. and shipments were routed through temporary agencies that existed for only weeks at a time. Delancey hadn't just erased one crate. He had built a system of transmutation, turning illegal ore into legal wealth. The paper empire. In early 1884, Hale and Elwood drafted a comprehensive report titled The Ledger Trail, Systematic Erasure of Mining Shipments via Railway Corruption, 1880–1883. It was ignored by the New South Wales Railway Commissioners, the Department of Mines, the Sydney Morning Herald. One editor anonymously replied, "Interesting but dense, no public outcry likely, not a story we can sell." Elwood didn't argue. He simply added the reply to his notebook. Hale, disappointed but not surprised, resigned 6 months later. Gow disappears. In May 1884, Richard Gow vanished from Goulburn. No notice, no letter. Witnesses said he had been visited by two gentlemen in clean suits, who spoke to him for nearly 2 hours behind the station. Afterward, he packed a single trunk and boarded the 8:15 to Campbelltown. He was never seen in railway circles again. Elwood believed he had been paid off, or perhaps protected, or both. No record exists of Gow after 1885. Dust to silence. By 1885, the Goulburn station ran smoothly once more. The manifests were clean. No ore samples went missing. And yet across New South Wales, land ownership patterns shifted subtly. Small plots near rail hubs were bought up by shell companies, then resold a year later, often for profit. A laundering cycle, one that left no gold, no paper, just new ownership deeds and forgotten crates. The second ledger remained in Elwood's possession until his death. Hale lived until 1898, never returning to railway work. He died in a modest home just outside Goulburn, with only one note pinned to his study wall. Not everything stolen is seen, not everything seen is believed. And so we end not with a robbery, but with a quiet reminder. The most successful crimes aren't always committed with force, but with routine, stationary, and no witnesses willing to lose their position over a crate full of dust. When the truth is overwritten by a cleaner manifest, who would ever know what vanished along the way? Story 3. The Black Ledger of Broken Hill. In the far reaches of western New South Wales, the outback town of Broken Hill was more than just remote. It was a boiling crucible of money, metal, and miners by the mid-1880s. Silver had brought the boom, but gold dust, traded quietly and unofficially, moved in its shadow, smuggled in toolboxes, wrapped in tobacco pouches, packed beneath false-bottom wagons. While official shipments from the mines were carefully recorded and taxed, there existed a second economy, unregistered ore, passing from hand to hand in the camps and bunkhouses, often extracted on personal time by men who knew where to look. One man tried to regulate it. His name was Philip Dunkerow. He kept a ledger. And then one day he was gone. Who was Philip Dunkerow? Dunkerow wasn't a detective or a railway clerk. He wasn't a miner either. He was what the locals called a broker in boots, a middleman who floated between the miners, the bank, and the postal rail line. He provided 3 things: small cash advances against expected ore, rail consignment arrangements for miners who wanted to send samples quietly, a reputation for keeping his mouth shut. He worked from a wooden shack behind the engine maintenance shed, far enough from the town's official depot to avoid scrutiny, but close enough to watch every outbound rail manifest. What made him dangerous wasn't what he said. It was what he wrote. The ledger. Dunkerow maintained a small black book, not the one he used for business quotes, but a second ledger, always carried in his coat or locked in a narrow drawer hidden under his desk. The men who used him knew this ledger existed. They joked about it, called it the last will of Broken Hill, a record of shipments that no one was supposed to know about. Inside were names of miners, mostly initials, weights in ounces and kilograms, pickup points along the Broken Hill, Menindee Spur line, cash advances given, shipping reference numbers. None of these shipments appeared on official manifests. They were moved by favor, quiet instruction, and loophole. The disappearance. In August 1887, Dunkero failed to open his shack. By midday, the gossip had started. No one had seen him for 36 hours. His room at the boarding house was still made up. His boots, coat, and watch were gone, but not his bedroll, not his pipe, not his desk key. Police searched the shack. The drawers were empty. The only item left on the desk was a single folded piece of paper. On it in pencil, "Some dust belongs in the earth, some on your hands, but never on the page." The empty train. On that same day, a northbound freight train from Broken Hill to Menindee experienced an unscheduled delay. A brake line failed 2 hours into the journey, just outside a remote siding at Packsaddle Creek. The conductor, Riley Hart, reported that when he and the firemen dismounted to investigate, they saw a horse-drawn cart disappearing into the brush at the base of the hills. No driver, no clear destination. Oddly, the freight manifest had shown 17 items loaded. When it arrived in Menindee, there were only 16. The missing item. A crate labeled Lead Samples Reclamation, marked with the initials PD. No one filed a loss. Rumors in the yards. Word spread through Broken Hill fast. Miners who had quietly worked with Dunkero began burning notes, hiding ore, or sending nothing at all. One man, Wally Sparks McTavish, later told a publican, "The book was the whole thing. If it's gone, they've got no proof. If someone's got it, then everyone's in a bind." Another miner claimed to see a man wearing Dunkero's watch chain on the Menindee platform a week later, but when questioned, the man turned out to be a railway supervisor from Adelaide, on temporary assignment. A mysterious deposit. 3 weeks after Dunkero vanished, the Bank of New South Wales in Adelaide received a private deposit of over £2,000 in coin, bullion, and scrap. The deposit was made in 5 installments, each by a different courier. No name was attached, but the deposits were logged under a reference code, BL14. When investigators later searched Adelaide's bank logs, they found the initials PD tied to a cash advance entry from nearly 2 years prior. Was this Dunkero's way of hiding the proceeds, or someone cashing out his blackmail ledger? The Whisper Campaign. By November, Broken Hill had grown more paranoid. Rail clerks refused side shipments. Mine supervisors instructed workers not to speak to any independent brokers. And 2 men who had formerly worked with Dunkero were found beaten behind the post office, their pockets turned out, their boots stolen. No charges were filed. A local constable, Ernest Cleary, later wrote in a private letter, "Someone is cleaning house, quietly, the kind of cleaning where no one asks about dust under the floorboards." So what happened to Philip Dunkero? Did he run, hide, or die? And more importantly, who took the black ledger, and what did they do with the names, the weights, the debts, and the invisible river of ore it recorded? Was this a personal crime, or the containment of an entire shadow economy, built on unspoken rules and unsanctioned trade? When a man vanishes in Broken Hill, it usually leaves behind something. A debt, a rumor, a body. But Philip Dunkero left behind nothing. Not a pipe, not a ledger, not even an alias. In a town full of extractors, he had been quietly mining a different commodity, information. Names, movements, cash routes, and rail patterns. When he vanished, so too did the invisible scaffolding that held up a significant portion of Broken Hill's gray market. In his absence, those who once depended on discretion were left exposed. Some ran, some paid, some started looking for the ledger. A miner's confession. In late November 1887, a miner named Clem Radley, known for drinking loudly and working, quietly staggered into Sergeant Cleary's office and blurted out, "I gave him 25 ounces, paid up front. He said he'd run it out on the 615 under a crate of drill bits, said not to worry, that he never lost a crate." Radley claimed he had been mining in an unclaimed gully near Silverton and had brought his dust directly to Dunkero, bypassing both the mine office and the bank. This wasn't uncommon. Miners who found luck on side ventures often preferred to avoid fees, taxes, or questioning. But his payment and the crate never reached Menandy. And more curiously, Radley claimed he had signed his initials into a corner of the crate. It wasn't about the gold anymore. He wanted to know if the crate had been real or if Dunkero had swindled him before disappearing. The Menandy ledger gap. Sergeant Cleary telegraphed Menandy's freight office and requested logs for September through November. What came back was strange. On September 11th, a crate marked for assay lab drill tools arrived via the 6:15 train. The crate was not listed on the original Galburn manifest, but was signed off as confirmed inbound by a supervisor named M. Teague. Cleary asked for access to the crate or its remnants. He was told, "Crate incinerated for scrap contamination, standard procedure." But here's the oddity. Crates contaminated with ore residue were typically sold to the smelters, not burned. Incineration was a last resort, used only in cases of biohazard, something Broken Hill had never once reported. The other black book. While following the paperwork trail, Cleary was approached by a figure from outside the regular ranks. Hugo Lawley, a part-time smelters agent who often ran errands between Adelaide and Wilcannia. Lawley claimed to have once worked for Dunkero indirectly, delivered crates, copied notes, retrieved coins. He said Dunkero had started a second ledger, a mirror book, with just numbers and aliases meant to serve as a decoy in case the real one was ever stolen. The black book was the record, but the red one was insurance, he said. Cleary asked where this second ledger was. Lawley replied. He sent it away before he vanished, to a contact in Hay, said if anything happened she'd know who needed to see it. The woman in Hay. Hay was 400 kilometers east, across scrubland and river plains, a major rail junction and transfer point for goods coming from the interior toward the coast. Cleary requested temporary leave and traveled there in December. He asked quietly about women who'd received parcels from Broken Hill. No one responded. But an elderly telegraph assistant, curious about Cleary's questions, mentioned that in late August, a tobacco tin wrapped in oilcloth had been handed in by a rail driver, addressed simply to M. Alden Hay Post Office. The clerk never showed up to collect it. The tin had been locked in a desk drawer ever since. Cleary requested to see it. Inside was a small, stiff book, red cover, spine cracked, pages lined in pencil. The handwriting matched samples of Dunkero's writing. Names without names. The ledger didn't list full identities, just aliases, weights, dates, and reference symbols. But patterns emerged. Blue Cap, 4 shipments, all within September. Gulliman, 2 shipments marked with the notation via Teague. Mallet, 5 shipments, 3 marked flagged for pressure. Greystone, 1 shipment, value £3,200. Cleary didn't recognize the nicknames, but he did recognize the final entry. A name not coded. Lawley Final 91 kg, settled debt. Dated 1 week before Dunkero vanished. Lawley's lie. When Cleary returned to Broken Hill, he confronted Hugo Lawley with the entry. Lawley denied knowledge, at first claimed it must be a mistake. But under pressure, he admitted that he owed Dunkero for a failed ore delivery, one that had resulted in a substantial loss. He was supposed to repay the debt by smuggling ore dust in an outbound shipment to a smelter in Adelaide. But the crate, the one Lawley claimed to have delivered, never arrived. Lawley's voice cracked when he said, "I didn't steal it, but someone knew it was going, knew the weight, the mark, the route, and then he just disappeared." Cleary asked who else knew. Lawley hesitated. The only man who signed the crate into the siding was Teague, but you'd have to ask him. Teague was already dead. A fall in the rail yard just 2 weeks after Dunkero vanished. Slipped, they said, head wound, unwitnessed. The final code. In the back of the red ledger was one last line. If the black book burns, the red one remembers, but the red is for waking, not justice. What did Dunkero mean by waking? A call to action, a warning, a threat. Perhaps he knew his ledger wouldn't bring the law. But maybe it would awaken someone to what had really been happening. A system of small thefts, quiet arrangements, and the monetization of blind spots. A town profiting not just from silver in the ground, but from the gold dust that moved invisibly between ledgers. And what if someone had wanted that system to stay hidden, even if it meant removing the man who recorded it? By the start of 1888, Broken Hill was no longer a frontier outpost, it was an empire of ore. Silver exports had doubled. New smelters lit up the skyline like electric ghosts. Rail cars rumbled in day and night. Miners came and went. Managers rotated like clockwork. And through it all, no one spoke of Philip Dunkero anymore. The man, the black ledger, and the network of unregistered gold shipments had all vanished into the outback air, burned, scattered, buried, or absorbed. But Sergeant Ernest Cleary had not forgotten. He still had the red ledger. Pattern recognition. Back in Hay, Cleary pored over the red book again, trying to map aliases to real people, movements to rail logs, weights to missing crates. He created diagrams, overlays, lists. The same names appeared at regular intervals. Bluecap always shipped via Gulgui. Gulliman exclusively used Wilcannia sidings. Mallet made no shipments after July 1887, the same month Dunkero started keeping the second ledger. And Greystone. Only a single shipment, but the largest. 3,200 pounds worth of dust, and no record of where it landed. The more Cleary studied the entries, the more he became convinced. This was not a simple catalog of gold dust favors. This was a map of power showing who was involved, who was valuable, and who had leverage over whom. The Wilcannia Trail. Cleary's investigation led him to Wilcannia, a dusty, sun-bleached town with a small station and big whispers. There, he found a former rail porter named Joss Harkin, who had worked the sidings from 1885 to 1887 before an injury took him off the line. When Cleary mentioned Dunkero, Harkin flinched. Then he sighed. He was clean, not greedy, just in the middle of something. I think he knew more than he should have. I think he started realizing what that ledger could do. Cleary asked what Harkin meant. Harkin said one of the last crates he handled had a double-bottom panel and came with instructions to place but not log. No signature, no paperwork, just a quiet nod from a man in a beige coat. The same crate, Harkin believed, matched one of the entries in the Red Book A Bluecap shipment, marked WIL3 in the margin. That was the week the old man started looking over his shoulder, Harkin added. You ever seen a man take notes on shadows? Disappearance revisited. Cleary began to suspect Dunkero had not fled, nor had he been killed for simple revenge. He'd been silenced, strategically removed at the moment. His knowledge turned from useful to dangerous. not just because he recorded crimes, but because he knew how to prove them. By controlling which crates went where, which initials tied to which route, and which railmen could be trusted, Dunkero was in the unique position to reveal coordinated diversions of unregistered rail personnel aiding in off-manifest freight moves, financial entity in Adelaide and Sydney laundering proceeds, and possibly who, at the state level, had sanctioned the blind eye. Adelaide Bank Trail. Using the reference code BL14 from the mysterious Adelaide deposits, Cleary submitted a discreet inquiry to a retired clerk from the Bank of New South Wales. What came back was chilling. The deposits had been dispersed immediately after receipt, broken into dozens of smaller transactions, converted to property deeds, bond notes, and shareholdings in multiple business fronts. No origin name. No verification process. But the first deposit had been authorized by an official transfer agent, who would later take up a post within the NSW Department of Mines. Dunkero's stolen wealth had not just vanished. It had been institutionalized. The final note. In early 1888, Cleary returned to Broken Hill one last time. He posted a note on the door of Dunkero's former shack, now boarded up and dry-rotted. If you are alive, your book told the truth. If you are gone, your book still does. He left the red ledger with a lawyer in hay sealed in wax, labeled only. To be opened upon publication of any public inquiry into mineral exports or unexplained rail losses, NSW. No such inquiry ever came. Legacy in ash. By the time Broken Hill's wealth peaked in the 1890s, the town was a different world. The gray market Dunkero had brokered was absorbed into larger, more professional syndicates. Brokers became firms. Crates became contracts. No one wrote anything down by hand anymore. No one trusted ledgers. And yet, a copy of the Red Book eventually made its way into a university archive, anonymously donated in 1923. Historians reviewed it but dismissed it as incomplete fiction. But one entry, a long passage written vertically in the margin, stood out. The weight of what wasn't declared will always be heavier than what was. For the dust stolen with violence is less dangerous than the dust stolen with silence. Paper is patient, but memory is dangerous. So what was the value of Philip Dunkero's ledgers? Not just the gold recorded within, but the proof that small systems, when repeated enough, can become invisible empires. Empires built not with guns or threats, but with unlogged crates, midnight manifests, and the right initials in the right black book. Story 4 tracks to nowhere, the Sandgate disappearance. Sandgate, New South Wales, known today as a sleepy coastal suburb. But in 1884, it was a minor cog in the sprawling railway infrastructure that fed Newcastle's coal exports and inland cargo movements. Unlike the bustling depots in Broken Hill or Goulburn, Sandgate had a single narrow platform, a freight siding, and a three-man staff. Trains didn't stop here unless they had to. But one cold morning in June of 1884, a train did stop, briefly, quietly, and afterwards something important was missing. But not just a crate. A record, a person, and eventually a purpose. A routine stop that was. On the morning of June 17, the 8:25 mixed freight from Tigges Hill rolled slowly through Sandgate's switch. Officially, it wasn't scheduled to stop, just pass. But according to Edward End Halley, the lone pointsman on duty, the train came to a full halt. The cause, a signal inspection delay. Halley logged the stop in the station notebook. The engineer, Tom Crone, later claimed he had no recollection of stopping. But Halley's notebook entry was clear. Train 127 stopped at 0843. Opened forward freight car. Unidentified man in dust coat exited and conferred with switch operator. reported by 0850. Crone swore no one disembarked. The vanishing consignment. By 10:10 a.m., the same train arrived in Broadmeadow, where rail clerk Miriam Goldsby began offloading and matching cargo against the Sandgate pickup manifest. She noted a discrepancy. One crate item C-94, marked for the Maritime Supply Office in Newcastle, was missing. The item had been checked onto the freight car at Tigges Hill, loaded under supervision. Crate contained machined brass parts, possibly used for navigational tools or small engine repairs. High value, private military contract. Estimated worth, £1,120. But at Broadmeadow, nowhere to be found. There was no tampered seal. No break in the freight car's integrity. No record of the crate ever being removed. The clerk with a memory. Miriam Goldsby, detail-obsessed and difficult to intimidate, reviewed the Tigges Hill cargo log herself. Crate C-94 had indeed been sealed and signed out by a porter named Douglas Sharp. She interviewed him that evening. Sharp told her, "I remember it because it was packed differently. Wooden ribs on the outside, and it was heavier than the manifest said. Dead weight, no give." Goldsby then asked if he saw the crate unloaded at Broadmeadow. "No, ma'am, I would have remembered that. Thing needed 2 men to shift. It simply disappeared somewhere between Tigges Hill and Broadmeadow. And the only stop along that stretch. Sandgate." The signal house silent. Halley, the pointsman who recorded the unscheduled stop, was approached again this time by a supervisor from the Newcastle branch, asking whether he had any other observations that morning. Halley hesitated, then said, "No, sir, just routine." But later that night, Halley left a note pinned to the door of the small signal house he used for his breaks. The note read, "I saw them open the car. I saw a crate come off, covered in canvas, rolled on a hand cart. 2 men, not in uniform. I didn't say anything because they looked like they belonged. You know what I mean." Halley was reassigned to Coastal Branch a week later. He never returned to Sandgate. The engineer's unease. Engineer Tom Crone, under pressure from Goldsby's persistent questions, finally admitted something. "We stopped, I remember now, but I was told not to log it." Told by whom? He wouldn't say. But Crone added something chilling. "There was a man who rode the front car. He said he was with Rail Protocols, showed a form, never spoke again, just watched everything." Goldsby asked what he looked like. Crone, gloves, gray coat, didn't sweat. A familiar profile, a Delancey-type figure, as Elwood once called them. The Maritime Office that didn't exist. Goldsby followed up with the Newcastle Maritime Supply Office. No crate had been expected. No requisition order matched C-94. No record of a shipment from Tigges Hill existed in their books. She checked again. The listed recipient on the Tigges Hill manifest was Ardelmer Maritime Office, Key 6, Newcastle. But Key 6 had no office structure. It had burned down the year before. So who was Ardelmer? Why had a non-existent destination been logged as an official cargo drop? And how did the crate vanish without the theft of anything else? Missing pages. 2 days after the incident, Goldsby returned to Sandgate's rail house to review the pointsman's logbook. The page for June 17th was gone. Torn clean out. The remaining stub showed pressure lines and entry had existed, but now it was missing. She questioned Station Master Clive Dorrance, who shrugged and said, "Halley must have taken it with him. He wasn't the best record keeper." But Halley's replacement later told Goldsby something else. "When I arrived, the desk drawer had been emptied. Only thing left was a copper wire seal broken. A crate logged. A man disembarked. A stop denied. a ledger page erased. And no one, not a single party, had filed a complaint of theft. Why? Because the receiving office didn't exist. The value was never declared publicly. The item vanished into paperwork and was written into nothingness. So the question is, was this a theft at all, or a planned extraction masquerading as a clerical ghost? The closer Miriam Goldsby got to the truth, the more it blurred. What had begun as a missing crate was quickly becoming something deeper, not a theft, not even sabotage, but a glimpse into a system of vanishing cargo, enabled by rail procedure, and protected by a network of men who never gave their names, wore no insignia, and walked in and out of stations as if they belonged. And somewhere between Tigas Hill and Broadmeadow, they had erased crate C-94 from existence. Now the question wasn't who took it, but how did they know exactly when and where to remove it, and who made it disappear from the books? The quiet code. Goldsby began poring over manifests from the week of June 17, looking for irregularities, not just missing items, but formatting changes, handwriting differences, and unusual designations. She found something curious in the Tigas Hill outbound book. All item entries followed the standard format. Item number, description, weight, destination, signature. Except for C-94, which had one extra line in red pencil beneath it. To be confirmed at junction, final route per designation flag. This kind of instruction did not exist in official rail protocols. When she asked about it, a foreman replied, "Oh, that's a flagged crate. They're not ours to question." Flagged by whom? Depot superiors, the man said with a shrug. But the depot superintendent, when questioned, denied authorizing any such flag. A familiar ghost. The description of the man in the gray coat riding the freight car had surfaced before across the rail system, over years. Wagga Wagga, 1876, during the gold crate disappearance. Galburn, 1883, during the erased manifest swap. Dubbo, 1885, when a smelter-bound shipment never reached Sydney. Always well-dressed, never confrontational, never stopping long enough to create a paper trail. Known only in whispers as Delancey or Mr. D. And now once again Sandgate. Was he an agent of the Rail Commission, of the Mines Department, or of something more ambiguous, a liaison between state departments and the gray markets they quietly benefited from? A name reappears. Goldsby returned to the Newcastle archives and searched for the name R. Delmer, the supposed recipient of the missing crate. She found one entry, not in maritime records, but in a land title transaction, dated 3 months after the Sandgate incident, a small property sold inland, under the name R. Delmer Holdings Limited. The buyer, a solicitor representing M.J. Delancey. The coal cart. A tip from a station cleaner led Goldsby back to Sandgate's rail siding. The cleaner mentioned an odd sight on the morning of June 17. 2 coal carts, usually loaded in the late afternoon, were pulled onto the siding earlier than normal and left with unusual weight. They groaned, miss, not like coal, like dead weight, tight-packed. One was driven by a man she'd never seen before. The other was covered in canvas, even though the day was dry. The cleaner didn't remember uniforms, only that both drivers wore gloves and neither spoke. Halley's final message. Goldsby tracked Edward End Halley to a small siding station on the Dorigo line. When she arrived, he was already gone, transferred again, this time with no forwarding address. But the station master gave her a sealed envelope Halley had left behind. Inside was a single sheet, a map of the Sandgate siding. On it, Halley had circled a spot just past the main switch with the note. C-94 taken here, cart waiting, no paperwork, no protest, just eyes. At the bottom, one last line. I saw who gave the nod. It wasn't a thief, it was our own. A closed door. Goldsby compiled everything: manifest copies, statements, the land sale record, Hall's notes. She submitted her report to the Newcastle regional office. A week later, she was reassigned to an inland post. No explanation, no thank you. When she inquired, her supervisor simply said, "You're too meticulous for a depot like that." No further investigation into crate C-94 was authorized. No inquiries were filed by Tigges Hill, Sandgate, or Broadmeadow. And by the end of the year, no record of the crate existed in the central index. It had been uncreated. So who removed it? Was it Delancey, a state-sanctioned diversion, a false shipment meant to mask a real transfer of government goods? Or was C-94 never meant to arrive its journey, only a veil for something else? And if the crate was gone, what if the whole incident had been designed to remove a witness, not just a box? There's a certain kind of silence that settles over unsolved crimes. It isn't just the absence of answers. It's a quiet agreement among those involved that the truth doesn't need to be spoken aloud, because it was never meant to be found in the first place. By late 1884, the incident at Sandgate had become exactly that. The crate was gone. The records were scrubbed. And the only people who remembered what really happened were either gone or moved sideways. Except for one, Miriam Goldsby. She remembered everything. A shadow in the side ledger. Back in Broadmeadow, Goldsby kept her own records not in the main manifest logs, but in a side ledger, a habit learned from an old clerk who once told her, "Truth goes in the margins, everything else is for show." In that side ledger, under the heading Crate C-94, she listed: original crate weight, 189 pounds. Origin, Tigges Hill. Markings, Ardelmer Key 6 Maritime. Final status, not received. Last seen, Sandgate 0843. Witness, E. Halley. Interruption, man in gray coat, gloves. Result, crate removed, root sealed, log erased. Then she added a simple line beneath. The crate was the signal, not the cargo. Layers beneath. Goldsby realized that C-94 may have served no material purpose at all. The brass parts were likely a front common enough in dockside equipment. But the lack of destination, the falsified recipient, and the appearance of an unverified agent all pointed to something else. A test or a signal, used by an internal network to mark a shift in operations. Perhaps to initiate the opening of a new diversion route, one that would later carry far more valuable or controversial material. It wouldn't be the first time a false shipment had been used to test railway blind spots. And if the crate wasn't meant to arrive, then its disappearance wasn't a failure. It was the point. A quiet visit. In January 1885, Goldsby received a visitor at her new post in Scone, a middle-aged man in a formal coat, who didn't give his name. He thanked her for her attention to process, handed her an envelope, and left. The envelope contained 40 pounds in banknotes, the equivalent of nearly half a year's salary. There was no letter, no signature. Just a small card inside that read: "Your record keeping is appreciated. We trust your silence will be equally disciplined." She never deposited the money. She burned it. The real destination. Through unofficial inquiries, Goldsby learned that around the time C-94 disappeared, a private contractor in Sydney had received a special delivery of precision-milled brass components, rushed via a courier line from a coastal rail connection. The contractor was known to supply the Colonial Naval Office a body, not often linked with rail shipments, and certainly not via minor depots like Sandgate. In short, it appeared that C-94 may have been part of an off-ledger government transaction routed in secret, disguised as a routine freight entry, and removed without oversight. Whether it was legal didn't matter. Whether it was visible did. Aftermath. Edward Halley remained on backwater lines until his death in 1911. He never gave another formal statement. Tom Crone, the engineer, retired early. When interviewed decades later, he said, "You learn when to stop asking who the passengers are." Station Master Clive Dorrance received a quiet promotion and was transferred inland. Miriam Goldsby left railway service in 1886, citing health reasons. She took her side ledger with her. No official investigation into Crate C-94 was ever launched. No newspapers printed a story. No parliamentary questions were raised. And yet, in a confidential archive at the Sydney Rail Ministry, a single memo from 1885 was later uncovered. It reads, "Ray Sandgate route test successful. No escalation. Proceed with Stage 2 manifest diversions via coastal sidings." Signed, MJD. The unspoken mechanism. C-94 wasn't stolen. It was activated. A tool within a larger system used not to transport, but to test, train, and obscure. And Sandgate was chosen because it was small, sleepy, and manned by people unlikely to ask questions. The crate's contents were never as important as its path. And those who watched the path carefully enough, they got a knock on the door. Because some trains don't just carry goods. They carry instructions, protocol, and the slow crawl of hidden infrastructure beneath the surface of public systems. And if you ask too loudly where the crate went, you may find yourself transferred to a quieter station, where the records don't go missing because no one writes them down anymore. Story 5. A Quiet Betrayal in Albury. Albury, New South Wales 1889. A rail town split by the Murray River, where the standard gauge tracks of New South Wales met the broad gauge lines of Victoria. It was, quite literally, a junction of systems and in more ways than just technical. Trains paused here to transfer carriages, switch engines, and realign protocols. With that pause came opportunity, a moment when responsibility was blurred between two rail authorities, a moment when someone could exploit a gap that no one wanted to admit existed. On the morning of March 17, 1889, something was quietly loaded into a locked baggage car at Albury Station. It was recorded as a special shipment, postal valuation item, marked for transfer to Melbourne via the next outbound. It never arrived. The clerk who logged it vanished 3 days later, and no one reported the item missing, because only one man knew it had ever existed. A package without a paper trail. That man was Victor Hearn, a railway auditor recently transferred from Sydney. Hearn was sharp-nosed, sharp-tempered, and obsessed with procedural integrity. He had arrived at Albury just a month prior, assigned to assess cross-border freight practices. He had noticed something odd. A series of shipments marked PV, short for postal valuation, a rarely used classification reserved for parcels of unusual worth. Diamonds for private clients, uncut opals, even bank-issued currency bundles. The oddity, these shipments had no accompanying ledger trails. They were marked on station logs, but not in the central manifests. The latest one, recorded March 17th, was item PV211A. Sender, Private Banking Consortium, Sydney. Receiver, W. Toller, Melbourne Postal Exchange. Contents, MISC, mineral certificates, face value £4,500. Hearn flagged it immediately. But when the Melbourne Exchange was contacted, they reported no such parcel ever arrived. The clerk who logged it. The booking had been processed by a junior freight clerk, Michael Creary, 26, quiet, known for his neat handwriting and punctuality. He had personally sealed the parcel crate and stored it in baggage car 2 before its departure on train 405. According to procedure, the crate should have been logged into Victoria Rail's receiving depot. It was. 3 days after the shipment, Creary failed to report to work. When a constable visited his lodging house, he found the room empty, the bed stripped, and a single personal trunk burned in the back alley. No forwarding address, no resignation letter. Just a single torn note in the fireplace grate. This was never mine to question. A train that didn't stop. Train 405 had been delayed that day, briefly halted at a remote siding near Barnawartha due to a signal check. No logs mentioned the delay. But a track watchman, stationed nearby, later told Hearn that he saw two men with a wheeled cart unloading a crate from baggage car 2. Didn't look like postal, looked like millwork or maybe mine tools, covered in sackcloth, heavy. He described one of the men, tall, black gloves, long coat, quiet, didn't speak. Again, the pattern emerged. The man in gray again. Hearn cross-checked old reports and rumors and began to see what others had seen before. The gray-coated man, present in Wagga Wagga, seen during the Sandgate crate extraction, linked to the Galburn manifest erasure, possibly tied to the Broken Hill Black Ledger. Now in Albury, never named, never logged, but always there when paperwork vanished and cargo slipped between definitions. The twin registry. Digging deeper, Hearn discovered something more troubling. 2 copies of the PV shipment register were being maintained at Albury. One was standard, reviewed weekly, sent to Sydney. The other was kept in a locked drawer in the station master's office, labeled Special Commission Ledger. This second ledger included shipments never forwarded to the main registry. PV 211A was listed there with a single annotation in red. Transfer by delegation, MJD oversight. Hearn had seen those initials before. MJ Delancey. A theft by permission. Hearn now saw the full picture. The parcel had been intentionally diverted. The clerk, Creary, had either been paid or pressured to handle it. After fulfilling his part, he had been removed. The shipment was not lost, it was absorbed. What remained was a false illusion of process. The crate had left under full compliance. The paperwork, at least one version of it, was clean. The only man who noticed the gap. Hearn, and even he wasn't sure whether this was a crime or a sanctioned shadow procedure. The post office's response. When Hearn sent an inquiry to the Melbourne Postal Exchange, he received a reply signed by W. Toller, the supposed recipient of the missing crate. Toller's response. No record of PV211A exists. No such shipment was expected. We trust your records will be adjusted accordingly. No explanation. Just a gentle instruction. Hearn's decision. Victor Hearn compiled everything he had: statements, the ledger copy, the description of the gray-coated man, the track watchman's account. He intended to send it to the Rail Commissioner's office in Sydney. Instead, he resigned. 3 weeks later, he boarded a steamer bound for Hobart, Tasmania, under a new position, Inspector of Port Cargo, Department of Docks. He never spoke of the PV case again. But his personal journal included one final entry on the matter. If a crate can vanish with permission, it's not theft. It's a mechanism. And I was never meant to see the gears move. So what exactly was in parcel PV211A? Was it truly mineral certificates, or a coded shipment disguised as postal freight? Was Creary paid to enable the handoff, or did he vanish to escape it? And most of all, how many other packages passed through that invisible junction where 2 rail systems touched, but no one took full responsibility? If you stand on the platform at Albury Station today, you'll notice the strange symmetry. One side of the rails once carried New South Wales standard gauge. The other, Victoria's broad gauge. In the late 1800s, this difference required passengers and freight alike to transfer trains at the state line. That transfer, brief, mechanical, tedious, became the perfect blind spot. Because once a crate was loaded off one carriage and into another, which system kept track of it? Who was responsible for its safe delivery? And most importantly, what happened if both parties trusted the same piece of misleading paperwork? The answer, as Victor Hearn had discovered, was simple. It disappeared. The watchman's story. After his resignation, Hearn wrote to the track watchman near Barnawartha, the one who'd claimed to see two men unloading the crate from train 405. The man replied with hesitation. "I was told not to say anything. They showed me a form, said it was special authority from intercolonial oversight. They wore pins, not rail pins, something else." When Hearn pressed about the form, the watchman said it wasn't signed by any known official. Just two initials at the bottom. MJD. Again, Delancey or someone invoking his name. The form wasn't part of any system Hearn had studied. It looked official. It just was. A familiar network. Before leaving Albury for good, Hearn compiled his research into a private ledger, which has since been recovered from his effects in Hobart. The ledger identified 9 suspect shipments over a 2-year span, all bearing strange similarities. Labeled as PV, Postal Valuation, RA, Rail Authority, or DL, Delegated Logistics. Loaded at Albury, passed to Victoria Rail, yet never acknowledged by the destination. Logged in the alternate Special Commission register, but not the main manifest. Often associated with unverified middlemen wearing gloves, long coats, and formal dress. Frequently involving younger clerks, newer hires, or those with no established connections. In 4 of the 9 cases, the recording clerk vanished or resigned within 14 days of the shipment. None of the crates were ever recovered. None were officially declared lost. Michael Creary's final movement. Thanks to a notation in the lodging book and a telegram intercepted by a sympathetic rail agent, Hearn learned that Michael Creary, the vanished clerk, had booked passage to Yass Junction under the name M. Creer on March 22, 5 days after the shipment of PV-211A. He never arrived. The train manifest listed him as aboard, but no witnesses at Yass recalled him disembarking. His room in Albury was later searched again, this time by someone other than police. The landlady described the men simply. They didn't wear hats, didn't speak, just nodded at one another. One had a rail badge, the other didn't. They left with a small envelope from under Creary's mattress. What was in it, no one knows. A parcel for no one. Hearn's belief hardened. PV-211A was never meant to be delivered. Its purpose was different. He began to suspect the following pattern. A fictitious sender, in this case, a private banking consortium. A fictitious recipient, W. Toller, at a postal facility that had never handled valuation shipments. A real valuable object inside or bonds, assay reports, even gold-backed paper. And a time transfer, intercepted at the siding between jurisdictions. With paperwork that almost matched the system, but wasn't filed in the right channels, so no one could investigate it. If the transfer was caught, it could be denied. If it succeeded, no one asked questions. And the clerk in the middle. Expendable. Victoria Rail's response. After leaving New South Wales, Hearn submitted a final report to Victoria Rail's central office, asking if they had ever received or recorded PV-211A. The response was brief. No record exists of item PV-211A. Your letter has been forwarded to our internal registry. Please cease contact regarding unmanifested items. It wasn't a threat. It was a closing of the door. A system of silences. In his final months as inspector in Hobart, Hearn quietly traced names from old reports' aliases, recipient initials, notary stamps. Many tied back to shipments that had moved through Albury, Goulburn, Wagga, Sandgate always briefly, always on the way to somewhere else. And the initials MJD appeared too often to be coincidence. He wrote in his private notes, "Delancey may be one man, but I believe now he is also a title, a signal. When the shipment is for Delancey, it is not for delivery but for removal." So what was the nature of the betrayal in Albury? Was it Michael Creary's betrayal of duty or the betrayal of Creary, a pawn in someone else's mechanism? Was Hearn right to walk away? Or did he simply recognize that some systems are built on permission slips no one is allowed to question? By the spring of 1889, the peculiar incident at Albury Station had faded into silence. The crate PV 211A was never found. The clerk Michael Creary never returned. The auditor Victor Hearn had resigned and relocated. But the ledger remained. Not the official one that had long been sanitized, purged of all traces of the rogue shipment, but Hearn's personal red leather notebook, stored among his effects in Hobart until it surfaced decades later. It contained diagrams, weight calculations, name correlations, and one chilling phrase repeated in several margins. The crossing point is where no one is responsible. The junction that hid everything. Albury, with its dual rail gauges, was never meant to be efficient, but its inefficiency provided cover. Hearn had noted that. In every transfer, paperwork had to be manually rewritten or retyped. There was no standardized oversight of what was handed off between systems. Items listed under PV, RA, or DL codes often vanished in the time gap between gauge switches. And most critically, no one claimed fault because no one ever had full custody. He called it the liminal gap, a moment of bureaucratic uncertainty where a crate, a clerk, or a cause could disappear forever. A letter never mailed. Among Hearn's possessions was a draft letter, never posted. To the railway commissioners. You are overseeing a network in which shipment integrity is not simply at risk, it is designed to be unknowable. The moment your documentation is duplicated across borders, its verifiability ends. I have witnessed at least 6 transfers vanish. In most cases, the items were rerouted, not stolen. But I ask, who rerouted them? If not you, then who gave the authority? And why do they wear no name? The letter ends abruptly. Perhaps Hearn understood that it would never be read, or worse, that it would and be ignored. The fate of M. Creary. Though Creary's disappearance was never investigated, several oral accounts later emerged conflicting, but oddly aligned in tone. One station hand claimed he saw Creary boarding a freight engine, headed the wrong way, toward Wodonga, not Melbourne. A postal worker in Echuca claimed a young man matching Creary's description applied for a job under the name Martin Keller, then vanished after 2 days. A retired port official in Sale swore he once saw a man with Creary's eyes, but dressed like a dock supervisor, and walking with a noticeable limp. In all accounts, the man disappeared again before questions could be asked. The Toller signature. One final piece unsettled Hearn more than the rest. In the private Special Commission ledger at Albury, several PV shipments were signed off to W. Toller. But the real W. Toller, once a rail inspector in Sydney, had died in 1887. That meant someone or some group was using a dead man's name to authorize packages that disappeared mid-journey. Why? Because no one questioned Toller, and no one had access to both ends of the journey. The signature was enough. A system built on vanishing points. By 1890, Hearn had stopped documenting the irregularities. His final note on the matter was brief. "I once thought this was a crime. I now believe it is a feature. Crates vanish because they are designed to. People vanish because they ask the wrong questions. And the system continues humming between rails." Legacy. Michael Creary's name was struck from the employment rolls with a single sentence: absconded post. The PV code quietly disappeared from rail ledgers over the next 3 years, replaced by more opaque categories. Delancey, if that was even a real name, was never formally identified, but references to MJD, special delegations, and discretionary routing persisted until well into the 20th century. The Special Commission ledger at Albury was destroyed in a fire in 1915. Arson was never confirmed, but the only cabinet affected contained internal correspondence and routing protocols. As for Hearn, he died in 1928, his personal notes unopened for decades. So was PV211A a theft, a leak, a test? Or was it part of an ongoing practice of intentional ambiguity, where value passed invisibly between systems, erased in the crossing? And in a railway world defined by platforms and paperwork, how many crates were just symbols, permission slips for those who understood the real system? Story 6. The Footlocker Job at Maitland. Maitland, 1892, a town nestled in the floodplains of the Hunter River, alive with rail traffic and agricultural bustle. Not quite as industrial as Newcastle, not as remote as Moore, but an important transit junction where parcels were rerouted, passengers switched trains, and freight often paused longer than expected. On the rainy morning of August 8th, a standard mixed goods train pulled into Maitland Station with a locked footlocker stored in baggage car 3. It was stamped and sealed, heavy, labeled simply, "To R. Thompson, Upper Hunter Trust, Singleton." There was nothing unusual about the crate at first, until someone tried to open it at Singleton and realized it wasn't the right crate. And the real one, the one packed with 1,600 pounds worth of gold, assay slips, and bond receipts, had never made it past Maitland. A routine chain of custody. The original locker had been loaded at Werris Creek, its weight logged at 89 kilograms, slightly heavy for paperwork but not suspicious for the banking firm that sent it. It was escorted by a junior banking courier, Stanley Webb, who rode in the last passenger car and checked the seal at every major stop. He confirmed its presence in Werris Creek, again at Muswellbrook, and once more at Maitland, where the train paused for nearly 20 minutes due to a platform congestion. At Singleton, Webb inspected the crate after offloading. The serial number matched, but the key didn't fit the lock. The latches were identical, but the lock had been replaced. Inside was not bank material, but a bundle of iron tools wrapped in burlap. Old, rusted, heavy. Absolutely worthless. The switch. Back at Maitland, a platform porter named Grady Ellis recalled something odd during the delay. He'd seen 2 men, neither in uniform, wheeling a footlocker off baggage car 3, placing it briefly under the platform awning, then rolling it back on. They presented a priority item transfer voucher, stamped with the seal of the Hunter River Regional Consignment Authority, a stamp he'd seen before, but never for regular banking freight. The porter asked no questions. The men were efficient, well-dressed, and carried themselves like officials. He now realized it wasn't the same locker they returned to the car. The banking courier's confession. Stanley Webb, the junior courier, was shaken. He had signed off at each stop. His instructions were clear: never let the footlocker out of sight. But at Maitland, while disembarking to stretch his legs during the 20-minute delay, he had lost sight of the baggage car for less than 4 minutes. When asked later why he left it unattended, he answered, "There was no indication the car had been opened. The seals were unbroken, I never thought someone could just swap it outright. The replacement locker had the same dimensions, same painted initials, same handling tag. Even the scuff marks had been matched. A copy of the real thing. The investigation uncovered the switched crate wasn't an old footlocker modified for disguise. It was a duplicate, made from the same hardwood, screws in the same places, handles in the same positions. Likely built weeks in advance, using precise measurements. Which meant one of two things. The original crate had been inspected and copied, possibly by someone with inside access. The lock combination and placement protocol had been studied. Either way, it wasn't an impulsive theft. It was a manufactured disappearance. Disappearing with permission. Hopping to trace the chain of authority, an inspector from the Railway Security Division attempted to validate the Hunter River Regional Consignment Authority voucher used by the two men. He found no such office existed. It never had. The stamp itself, however, was traced back to a small defunct warehouse in Newcastle, once operated by a freight brokerage tied to the Maritime Ministry. One of its last known administrators, a man named Delancey. The real locker's trail ends. Inquiries along the line from Maitland yielded no sightings of the original locker. No station remembered receiving it. No rail workers recalled moving it after Maitland. But 3 days after the incident, a farmhand outside Greta A village, just 20 minutes west, found fragments of a wooden locker in a dry creek bed. Partially burned. Inside the charred frame, melted brass hinges, torn burlap, and a crumpled envelope bearing the watermark of the Upper Hunter Trust. Nothing else remained. The courier's fate. Webb, disgraced, was removed from his post. But 6 months later, he was seen working quietly in Newcastle, not in banking, but as an administrative assistant to a shipping firm involved in intercolonial maritime supply. That firm's registry listed its corporate address as Key 6, Wharfside Exchange Office 3. No such office existed when an investigator followed up a year later. The building was vacant. So what happened to the real locker? Was it stolen or rerouted with silent approval? And who authorized a perfect replica to be loaded back onto a government-secured baggage car without any questions? Was the betrayal a weakness in the chain of custody, or was the system built to allow the key to be copied, so long as the lock looked convincing? By the time investigators from the New South Wales Government Railways arrived in Maitland, the evidence had already vanished. The swapped crate filled with rusted tools had been returned to Sydney for documentation, but yielded no fingerprints, no unique identifiers, and no clues beyond one unusual detail: the stamp. Pressed on its baseboard near one of the handles was a small round ink seal. HRCA, Hunter River Consignment Authority. Approved Transit Override. It was this seal, and the matching paper voucher shown to the porter, that had allowed the two men to remove and replace the original locker without hesitation or scrutiny. The only problem: no one knew what the Hunter River Consignment Authority was. The Phantom Office. A search of colonial business directories turned up no agency, company, or consortium by that name. When inspectors visited the address printed on the voucher, a shipping office near Newcastle's Old Wharf, they found a disused building, partially collapsed, with no active tenants for over a year. There were remnants of office furniture, but no ledgers. No correspondence. No shipment logs. The only remaining object of interest: a locked cabinet bearing the faded lettering. HRCA Permits and Clerks. The lock had been forcibly broken. The cabinet was empty. Whoever had operated from this office had taken their records and walked away well before the Maitland job occurred. Reproducing the seal. The forensic team attempted to replicate the stamped seal found on the false locker. The ink used, a rare aniline dye compound no longer used in standard rail applications, phased out for being too chemically unstable. The stamp itself, of a type used in maritime freight offices, not rail. This meant the stamp wasn't from a rail division at all, but possibly from a dissolved shipping oversight board, repurposed to provide a false sense of authority during the locker switch. Whoever had created the stamp knew that it didn't need to be legitimate. It only needed to appear so in the moment it was flashed. And it worked. The second crate. Investigators began suspecting that the Maitland incident wasn't unique. Digging through internal transport logs, they found a suspicious crate replacement just 1 month earlier in Muswellbrook, involving a sealed crate bound for Lithgow, allegedly carrying bonded surveyor maps, a routine platform delay due to an engine coupling issue, a courier presenting an override voucher from an unfamiliar agency, and a nearly identical weight mismatch upon arrival. That case had been closed quietly due to the missing contents being insured. But when placed beside the Maitland switch, the similarities were unmistakable. The same modus operandi, a credible-looking authority, a brief, unexplained platform pause. No force, no theft, just permission slips and presentation. Stanley Webb's reinvention. The courier from Maitland, Stanley Webb, left the public eye. But internal investigations found that within 6 weeks of the incident, Webb had been hired by a private exchange syndicate operating out of Newcastle and Melbourne. The company was called Aquila Holdings. Officially, it brokered maritime freight insurance. But according to a former dockworker interviewed in 1912, Aquila operated a side chamber in its Newcastle office. Some crates were never checked in. They came off the train and went straight into the back. We were told they were interconsignment swaps, but the same crates never came out. Aquila Holdings closed its office 2 years later. No reason was given. The replica's source. A carpenter in Maitland, Elijah Brand, 62, came forward after seeing a sketch of the false footlocker in a newspaper. He believed he had been hired to build it. A month before the incident, 2 well-dressed men approached him with precise measurements, requesting a custom footlocker identical to a railway model, including painted initials, hinge types, and handle length. He asked no questions. They paid in cash. When investigators pressed further, Brand recalled a chilling detail. One of them said something odd: "It has to look used, not damaged, like it's already seen miles." That stuck with me. No official charges. Despite clear evidence of a premeditated switch, no charges were ever filed. Why? The contents of the real locker had not been cataloged publicly, allowing the bank to claim plausible ambiguity. The seal and voucher, while fraudulent, bore enough procedural ambiguity to confuse mid-tier investigators. Webb, the courier, was never charged with negligence, likely in exchange for quiet resignation. The locker swap occurred during a documentation lag in Maitland's rail office paperwork, for the train was finalized only after its departure, leaving no official record of the locker's presence at Maitland. The theft, in effect, never officially happened. So was this just a single con, or part of a larger pattern of transit stage manipulations? Was the entire operation designed to seem accidental to allow insurance claims to flow, responsibility to blur, and perpetrators to vanish? And how many override vouchers were still out there, tools for quiet vanishing, waiting for the right platform delay? In the official ledgers of the New South Wales Government Railways, the incident at Maitland Station on August 8, 1892, is noted simply as a cargo discrepancy resolved by dispatch. No mention of a theft. No mention of a missing courier item, and certainly no reference to a forged agency or duplicate crate switch. But in private memoranda passed between senior rail officials, a different phrase was used to describe what had happened. A closed-loop error, misfiled with intent. This phrase would become something of a euphemism in bureaucratic circles, a code for a misdeed so meticulously orchestrated that uncovering it would do more damage than letting it stand. Because the truth was now evident. The Maitland footlocker had never gone missing. It had been deliberately redirected under the guise of official procedure to vanish without trace. Ghost trails and vanishing points. In the months after the Maitland incident, 3 more freight discrepancies occurred along the Hunter line. A sealed container of surveyor bonds vanished between Singleton and Muswellbrook, despite being marked as delivered. A parcel crate with architectural plans intended for a public works office arrived containing only charcoal dust and a railway wrench. A post office packet from Armadale, said to include colonial tax certificates, was logged but never received. In each case, the crates passed through Maitland or stopped near sidings maintained by temporary rail contractors. Paperwork showed authorization overrides, and witnesses recalled men presenting badges or stamped forms no one had the authority to question. Who was behind it? Despite growing suspicions, no specific person was ever charged. But patterns emerged. The Hunter River Consignment Authority stamp reappeared in at least 2 other cases. The mysterious freight brokerage, Aquila Holdings, continued to operate quietly from Newcastle until 1894, before vanishing. And the same initials MJD were penciled into the corner of a requisition form recovered from Maitland Station Master's bin, weeks after the original switch. Those initials, which had also appeared in Victor Hearn's Albury case, suggested either a single person traveling under aliases, coordinating inside access to regional depots, or a network using the same procedural disguises and phantom credentials to facilitate cargo redirection along railways across 2 colonies. Either way, Delancey, or the role associated with him, was involved again. The silence of Singleton. The Upper Hunter Trust, who were expecting the original footlocker, never formally filed a complaint. When asked why, one internal memo simply noted, "Parcel insured, circumstances unclear, not pursuing." But that raised more questions than it answered. Why would a financial institution simply let £1,600 worth of sensitive instruments disappear? Unless, perhaps, they'd been warned off or even compensated privately. Inquiries made in 1915 by a historian found that the Singleton branch had closed its records from 1893 to preserve archival integrity. What was being preserved remained unknown. A train that wasn't logged. Perhaps the most chilling discovery came years later. In 1903, a retired Maitland dispatcher named Edward Shreves told a local reporter that a second train had departed Maitland on the same morning as the incident. A short, 3-car consist, unscheduled, and loaded from a siding. He had no record of it, but he remembered the engineer saying, "New instructions from Newcastle, special cargo, one-time route." That train was seen again heading west, near Branxton. After that, it was never logged again. How do you solve a crime no one admits happened? The Maitland footlocker switch was elegant not just in its execution, but in its deniability. The replacement crate made it to its destination. The bank was reimbursed. The courier was quietly transferred. The station staff followed protocol, or thought they did. The theft, if you can call it, that was a performance of authenticity. At every stage, it looked real enough to avoid alarm. And when suspicion arose, it was already too late. The real cargo burned, rerouted, or disappeared into a system designed not to track what mattered.